Welcome back to the show. I'm Molly Dewey here interviewing my new friend Jim Moisson from Paul Hobbs Winery. How are you, Jim?
I'm well, thank you.
So exciting that you are here for the culinary weekend. We're so excited to learn all about Paul Hobbs Winery.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here. We've been coming here for about 20 years. My children have been raised on this mountain and all know how to ski. And it's always fun because when I tell people I'm from Arkansas, there's always that like, what? And you're here skiing. And I say, even when we have a bad year like last year, the conditions are still better here than they are in Arkansas.
It's true. It's very true.
and then the other thing is when I tell people I sell wine for a living, number one, I can never have a bad day because my friends just say, get over it, you sell wine. And number two, I work for one of the greatest winemakers of all time, Paul Hobbs.
Yes.
And
so who is this Paul Hobbs?
yeah, so Paul is, first thing he'd tell you, he's a farmer.
Okay.
He's the second oldest of 11 children that grew up in an apple farm in upstate New York. And he went to school. He was going to study medicine, but he had an experience with his father as a kid where he was introduced to wine, and he just fell in love with it. So he went to school at Notre Dame, and then he switched over and he started studying wine over at UC Davis.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah, and he just decided he wanted to get into the wine business.
Yeah,
so
it was his calling.
It was his calling. He wrote a thesis as part of his graduate study at UC Davis, which is called, Winemaker University. And it caught the attention of another famous winemaker by the name of Robert Mondavi. And Paul went over and he was hired and he became an assistant winemaker and then a winemaker at Robert Mondavi Winery. So great pedigree. In fact, he was the head enologist when the Mondavi and Rothschild family started Opus One.
Okay, so he's got some major experience.
He's got some great experience. So fast forward a couple years later, I think the other thing to know about Paul is besides being a farmer and phenomenal winemaker is he's this adventurer pioneer. So he was one of the first guys to go down to Argentina back in 1988.
Oh, wow.
Right. So he started, and at this time, if you ever want to read a great book, there's a book out there called The Vineyard at the End of the World. And it talks about the Argentina wine industry. And it really is fascinating because it parallels the United States wine industry very much so, except that Argentina until the early 1990s was pretty much so a very isolated country. They produced a lot of wine, but not very much of it got out of the country.
Oh, interesting.
So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they started competing on the world scene with winemaking, and Paul was at the forefront of that. He worked with Nicholas Catina as a consultant. In fact, Paul's consulted with wineries all over the world, and he started, consulting with them, and he was one of the original importers of brands that were coming in from Argentina, like Alamos, back in the early 1990s.
Very cool.
So fast forward, Paul goes in, and then he starts his own winery in 1991 called Paul Hobbs Wines. And kind of the parallel between his apple orchard upbringing and his winemaking process is his father. Paul tells a story about his father took him in as kids. They'd take him into the barn and he'd blindfold them and he'd cut up pieces of apple and he'd have them taste it. And he'd say, now what kind of apple is this?
Oh, that's so cool, like blind wine tasting.
Like blind
Very
wine
similar.
tasting. And then when they got good at that, they'd say, okay, where in the orchard is this from? So now you look at Paul Hobbs. Yeah, so it's neat. So when you look at Paul Hobbs wines, there's 22 wines in the portfolio.
Okay.
18 of those are very site-specific, terroir-driven wines.
Okay.
Those are the Beckstoffer wines, the Nathan Coombs, the Sonoma Coast, Russian River, Edward James.
Okay.
Too many to list. But when you taste a Paul Hobbs wine, Paul wants you to have the experience of you're standing in the vineyard. So the whole terroir, as far as
I love that.
Yeah, the weather, the soil, and everything that's involved with the winemaking. So
fantastic. So where can people find Paul Hobbs wines?
Paul Hobbs Wines, the first thing you could do is you could join our mailing list, and that's at info. Just send a request at info@paulhobbswines.com.
Okay.
Also, we're distributed throughout the United States and throughout the world.
Perfect.
Some of our wines are small production, allocated wines that are, unless you're part of the mailing list, probably wouldn't get access to.
So get on that list.
Get on the list.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for chatting with us. So great. So great to have you here in Beaver Creek.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, we are going to check in with Mark Sassy, who is on a little first chair adventure somewhere up on this mountain. Stay tuned.